It's the state of the dungeon. It's a video that Rob does about his games. Yeah! Hello friends, and welcome to my State of the Dungeon address. I'm Rob, and we were finishing off a short story arc in the game The Princess Bride, the role-playing game, which again uses the fudge dice system. Pretty good little game, honestly. And the groups enjoyed it quite a bit. But we are now at the climactic battle. Possibly the greatest sword fight of all time, part 2. And a large hostile force of Gilder raiders, and the player playing the fencer, Renoir Lefez, could not make it due to purposes of employment. We were all saddened for this because it looked like it was going to be his moment to shine. Or hilarious things to happen, knowing how his luck had been so far, but it was going to be good. So instead, to be fair, what I did was I understood what the player wanted to do as he had dialed it in and sent it in, and it was reported to me. He was interested in attaining the hat of the Lady in Black, the leader of the Gilder Raiders, because his hat had been ruined by Cat, and then he was rocking a replacement beret which did not suit him. So, he wanted her hat. And that, of course, was going to come by victory of a tense battle. But without him being here, that kind of took the wind out of the sails, so I compensated as best as I could. At the start of every round, I would roll the 4 fate dice and see what the result was. If it was more positive, that meant Renoir was taking the lead and he was winning and, getting the better of his opponent. If it was going to be negative, she would come out on top a bit, and it was a bit of a teeter-tottering effect. And because they were both equal in skill, a little banter here and there to try to crystallize it, but it really became the story of everyone else, and not so much the story of what I was reporting what was happening, but everybody had their own things to worry about. Bonk, of course, is a giant who is surrounded by people, so Bonk was immediately interested in helping. Bonk was not interested in doing the big dynamic thing. So when the rest of the group who weren't interested in fighting as much went to try to free the prisoners, who included the romantic interest for Josie, the young soldier who had been captured by the Gilder Raiders. And as they found out, the prison also held Captain Pruce, who was the object goal for One-Eyed Pete. Well, that was certainly where a bit of focus was put, to say the least. To the point where Arnor, who really doesn't like conflict all that much, decided to employ lock-picking skills to open up the lock on the prison. And the prison was, of course, a converted spring cellar from the buildings that were here that were present in ruin when the Gilder Raiders made this their encampment. So they turned it into a prison, put a good door and a good lock on it. Now here's the thing, Arnor is a criminal. Arnor doesn't have lock-picking skills. In some ways, Arnor is not the complete package for criminal activity. But Arnor had a dagger, and in fantasy movies, if you poke at a lock enough with a dagger, you'll eventually pick it. Despite logic, it works. So Arnor immediately began doing that. Josie waded into the fray with her quarterstaff and started beating the raiders. Now, at the time that we started the whole thing, Renoir and their commander were sizing each other up and ready to start fighting. They were surrounded by 80 Gilder soldiers. Surrounding them were, of course, the walls of the fortification, which were being scaled by the pirates of Lady Maybelle, the now intended of Bonk, who, when she was knocked unconscious, Bonk was declared the victor, and the soon-to-be husband of Lady Maybelle. Well, she wanted to, as I've discussed, she needed money for the wedding, and the biggest source of money that wasn't being guarded by armies was this group of Gilder Raiders, who had disguised their numbers. Nobody knew that they had a substantial force of over 150 men, but she decided to attack it, and it just so happened that Bonk and the group were attacking at the same time. Aren't movies fun? So, these pirates, who are exciting cinematic pirates, all of them have their own unique flair. One of them uses a whip and cracks it down at his enemies. Another one throws daggers with keen precision and style. And another one is a great grappler who uses pro wrestling style moves, brother. So, yeah, they're a collection of eccentric pirates, which means they're absolutely devastating to these killers. I was rolling every round as an enemy action to kind of see how they were doing. And I was also rolling to see how the pirates were doing, and again, allowing more of a teeter-totter effect. My dice hated the Gilderites. The Gilderians could not get a good roll for anything. I was rolling routinely triple negatives, a quadruple negative at one time. They were terrible. Just as bad, outside of the barracks were about half of the Gilderites. They had bows. They were going to do a lot of damage to the Florin army, well, at least the branch that was taken care of by the Baron, who they had helped save his son. So as they were coming up the hill, the Gilder archers were going to do some really impressive damage. There wasn't great cover, and they were going to have to go uphill, exposed most of the way. To archers, this is perfect. And they would be able to retreat back into their fortress if they got close. Well, I rolled so badly for them that they got outflanked by cavalry, and cavalry against archers is not usually pretty. So that was decided. The Gilderians did very little to the Florin army. They were just inept, hopelessly inept, because my dice were terrible. The rolls I was giving for them went something like poor, terrible, fair, poor, and then they got steamrolled. The Florin army rolled passably good, which was far better than the terrible results that the Florin opponents were actually putting forth. Likewise, I was rolling well for the pirates. The pirates were getting a chance to do things, so I described how the pirates were absolutely dropping down on the Gilderian soldiers, and they were just beating them senseless, and the mayhem was great. The gates got kicked open, and Lady Maybelle, with her huge sword in hand, joined the fray. At this time, too, though, the group was having to face the results of all of these Gilderians around them, because the pirates didn't have the numbers to completely take away the threat. And for some of them, they wanted to just get their pound of flesh. Now, for some reason, Arnor chopped the head off of the guy that he and Arnor had shivved in the corner as the scene was opening. He cut his head off for some reason. And he looked quite the sight, with a bloody blade and everything. He did manage to ghost through the Gilderians, though. And his idea was to distract the Gilderians so that the archers wouldn't be able to fight back against the Florin defenders, which wasn't a bad strategy at all. So he went and he got a cask of oil and he started soaking cloth with it to the purpose of setting fire to their loot. He wasn't in this for the money. He had his own reasons. Arnor was trying to pick that lock. Bonk came over and tried to help. First try, Bonk tried. Ow. Door hard. Second try, he cleared it, just crushed the door, which freed the prisoners. Arnor then said, okay, they're free, I'm going to go see what else I can do. So he slithered through the fight and went to try to help with Manfredi, the agent. And Manfredi had, like I said, been if I had said Arnor before, I apologize. It was Manfredi who did this. He was applying the oil to the cloth. A Gilder soldier came at him, and Manfredi basically chucked the barrel and hit him in the chest. Despite the fact that Manfredi isn't the most physically imposing person, the dice were with him for that. And later they would turn. And Arnor came over. He's like, "Hey, I know what you're doing. I can try to help. I'm going to go get a fire." So he went over to the cooking fire that were down to coals, and he was going to get fire. So eventually they start up the fire. Big smoke plumes, which didn't do a great deal to distract the archers outside because, well, they were doing terribly anyhow, so any distraction didn't help them at all. At this time, though, the Gilderians were closing on poor Josie and One-Eyed Pete, and, well, to say the least, they were holding their own. One-Eyed Pete had a leather jerkin on, which did protect him from the worst of a nasty scratch, but his counterblow completely eviscerated one of his foes. As a matter of fact, he put 2 down. Josie was finding out that her quarterstaff works quite well, especially since it has a longer reach than her opponent's swords. So she was able to smack heads from a distance every time she would swing. Josie is built like the pro wrestler Chyna from back in the day in the 90s. So she's girthy, and when she hits, it makes a loud impact, and her dice were hot. So she was felling Gilderians herself with her staff. They kind of remarked that it was a weird cross between Gabrielle from Xena Princess Warriors meets Chyna. And it really was. She had a pretty impressive body count in front of her intended. She was there to rescue him. She never really made a motion to him, unfortunately. I think the moment was lost in a rewrite of the script. They would have met in the battlefield, and she would have been fighting with her staff, and he would have... Didn't get to that point because, well, Bonk was also attacked. And Bonk tried to deflect the attacks with his chest. Now, if you're, 7 foot tall, you're huge. You're not sword-proof, and Bonk got hurt by swording this way. Lady Maybelle saw that. It wasn't pretty. She strode across the battlefield and killed 5 of them in a pass. She was a terror trying to cover for Bonk. Bonk himself was hurt. He'd been hurt before, and he was not helpless, but she smothered him. Because she's like, "Oh, he's hurt. No, not my Bonk." Oh, it's great. I gave her this great voice. And everyone looked at her and was like, "That's the voice you're using for her?" Yep. It was fun. So yes, she came in like this great opera singer of old and just charged through the fray and bodies scattered. And her pirates were doing well, although some of their numbers had dropped because the Gilders eventually got a good die roll or two, so they were able to fight back somewhat. But honestly, it really was anticlimactic in terms of the threat of the battle. Most of them got away without really much of a scratch, which actually kind of fits the movie. You didn't see Fezzik walking around with a pile of injuries in the end of the Princess Bride, and Wesley wasn't terribly injured either, except coming back from being mostly dead. So, in that way it worked. For the most part, they wrapped up the Gilderians without too much difficulty. Bruce and One-Eyed Pete were fighting back to back, which was good. One-Eyed Pete threw him a cutlass, and the two proved to be too much for the Gilderians who stood against them. Bonk also, again, helped to deal with several of the Gilderians and was really instrumental to peeling people off of Bruce so he didn't get gang destroyed. Josie also kind of came to his side and was fighting in that melee. They were just rolling too well. They just beat the Gilderians that were in front of them, and because the pirates were doing so well, and there was nothing left outside after the Florin army came charging in with those cavalry, there was nothing. I could have cinematically rang in some bogus NPC, but they won. They rolled too well, and quite honestly, it was fairly won. Their characters pulled off the skills they needed to as they needed to. Now, Arnor was, she had helped to start the fire, and towards the end, things were looking okay, but Manfredi had the idea, well, they have wealth here. Let's try to get it onto the wagons. And there were wagons left over from the merchants because they had taken them. So he went to look for the horses that were hobbled on the other side close to the cooking area. Manfredi also saw that the cook for the Gilderians had come out. He was a soldier, but he wasn't the bravest of the lot, which is why he was put on cooking duty. Then he makes a pretty good frittata. But he came at him with a frying pan. And this is where Manfredi's, the strength of Manfredi broke. Because his dice went south badly. Manfredi is deadly with a dagger when the dice are smiling on him. They didn't smile on him. And that cook rang him 2 shots over the head with his frying pan that the camp could hear like a bell. Arnor came up from behind him and doing his best Manfredi impression, just backstabbed him through the kidneys with his dagger. And that pretty much sorted the fight out right there. Now, why did Arnor go back there? Partially because he heard the bell, but also Arnor was looting. And Arnor saw that over in the pavilion, that's where a big chest of gold was. So Arnor went over there and started loading up his pockets. Manfredi realized at this time that the pirates had basically taken the inside of the fortress, so that's why he was kind of making his own headway. And Renoir was finishing up the battle. The exchange was great, and at several points, Renoir snatched her hat and put it on himself, and then she would win. She would take the hat back after kicking him, and eventually, I rolled 3 positives. This is at the time when she knew that her men were done, and she was surrounded by pirates, and all she could think of was trying to finish him off quickly so she could make her escape. So she lunged, which he parried and knocked her over the back of the head with the pommel of his sword, which sent her sprawling. She was injured, bleeding, and tired from the fight, so yeah, she went down. So the fight was completely over. At this point, of course, Lady Maybelle was tending to Bonk and calling for her doctor, when the son of the Baron, the younger son, who was leading the army, came into the encampment through the smashed gate with a few of his own men. And there was a negotiation. Lady Maybelle has a price on her head from Prince Humperdinck, and Baron's son made her aware of that, and she's proud of that. But she dared him to try to take it. And he realized that while he probably could, he still had the army with him. They had both fought a vicious foe, and she helped him. So he didn't have to go into the camp and try to fight a siege, basically, on a high hill that they really weren't prepared for. So the pirates took the brunt of that, and while Lady Maybelle's forces were somewhat diminished, all the same, he said, tell you what, we never met. We'll just both walk away from this. And when Lady Maybelle said she was taking the treasure, the group said, yeah, she was a big help. They swayed him, and he's like, you know what? We searched the camp and found nothing of value. And he turned around and they walked away. Cool. So, the group got together and they're like, okay. Arnor was stuffing his pockets full of gold. Bonk had found the young man, but what he really found was true love, or a reasonable facsimile thereof, and as he was carried out in the arms of Lady Maybelle. And he seemed to be okay with that. It seemed to be a pretty happy ending. One of the false camera ending was of them smooching on the deck of the pirate ship while the pirates all cheered. And at the same time, we had Manfredi. What made Manfredi's story end? Manfredi surreptitiously slipped over to where his actual target was, who was the leader of the Gilderians, who had a death order from Manfredi's master. Manfredi pulled out his dagger, and going into one of the wounds, the scratches basically, that had been opened up in the sword fight, while she was unable to defend herself, he finished her off in a very neat political assassination. and accomplished his mission, did everything he was called upon to do. And the camera ended. But it was a false ending because Josie had been reunited with her beloved, and they got a nice smooching at the end too, and a happily ever after. So, Renoir won his hat, and he had the great sword duel he had been looking for. Bonk, again, true love, and now a pirate captain Bonk, so scary. Arnor now had a good amount of wealth to set himself up as a successful criminal. Now going into being a criminal mastermind rather than a street level criminal. We're pretty sure that Josie and her intended are going to be pretty happy together. And One-Eyed Pete went in with Captain Pruce, also took a big heaping pocketful, double handful, and a hatful of treasure and slipped off before either the army or the rival lake pirates could catch either of them, to go back and find a new ship and commence with their pirating throughout the waters around Florin. So, happiness all around, which is how a Princess Bride role-playing game really should end. So, what did we learn? That disparate groups of people, sometimes with differing agendas, can find a common ground and can tell a pretty darn entertaining story, even when the dice go completely and horribly awry. For a great portion of it, it was a lot of fun. Great story. Only slight fly in the ointment was that unfortunately we didn't have a full crew at the end, and we missed you. We missed you, we did. But still had a great ending to it. So everybody should be really happy about that. We worked on narrative play. We just need to work a little bit harder at people describing their actions and helping to narrate them out, to think about all the different ways they can make what they do neat and cool and, you know, a little more cinematic, and I think we'll be in a good place. But this ended so that we could go on to the next storyline, which is the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons GUI Cube Adventure, The Darkest Dream, Chapter 1 of the Red Star Rising campaign, which we will be recording. So my need for doing character witnesses for those, State of the Dungeon addresses, will be a little bit more limited when you'll be able to see the actual play, depending on how they turn out. So that was The Princess Bride, the role-playing game. We really liked it. We liked it a lot, and I think we'll be going back to that and something like that in the future. I have in the past said that the Fate system just doesn't hold enough for me. My position has softened on that somewhat, and in fact, I may end up having to give it a little bit more of a try. In fact, this particular game has opened up other potential games, including the aspect of Fate, the source book that I, in a very small way, helped to contribute to at least some of the editing of, which was a work by a friend of mine, Megan Bennett Burks, in Leaves of Chiaroscuro, which I might actually do now that I'm not really as disdainful of Fate as I used to be. So we'll see. But until then, true believers, stay tuned and we'll have another State of the Dungeon address. Until then, thank you and farewell.